This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is March 28th. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Cristina Roach.
Hey, everyone.
We have three interesting segments for you today. Adam takes a deep dive into maps and whether they're racist. And Darren, who read like 100 books last year, is going to tell us which were his favorites. But first, Cristina, you going to talk to us about this news in the Suez Canal?
I am. Now, by now, you've probably heard the news about the Ever Given, a massive container ship which is nearly as long as the Empire State Building is tall. It ran aground and is blocking passage of Egypt's Suez Canal. Now, high winds and poor visibility due to a sandstorm were originally reported as the cause. However, the chairman of the Suez Canal Authority, Osama Rabi, excuse me if I'm pronouncing that wrong, has since stated that weather conditions were not the main reason for the ship's grounding. He told reporters, quote, "There may have been technical or human errors, and that there would be an investigation." Now, whatever the reason, this is all bad news. The Suez Canal accounts for approximately 30% of container ship traffic globally each day, with the alternative shipping route taking a week longer. Refloating the massive container ship is technically very complicated, and it could take days or possibly even weeks. There are already significant supply chain issues, as we know, due to the coronavirus pandemic, and this logjam in the Suez Canal has made things worse. According to experts, the blockage is costing about $400 million an hour,
Wow.
and it could cause shortages of a number of goods. Lars Jensen, an independent container shipping expert, told NBC News, this incident will affect, quote, anything you see in the stores. One particular item that we could see shortages of is, here we go again, toilet paper. Walter Shaka, the CEO of Suzano, which is responsible for about 1/3 of the pulp used to make toilet paper globally, told Bloomberg that this would likely push his company's shipments back more than a month.
Darren actually posted an article about this, and it was quite interesting. I think coffee could be a problem, gas possibly, and furniture. And I was reading that I think they were speaking with someone from Lazy Boy saying that something you order could take up to 9 months to get from the day you ordered it. And I guess it could be that you just need one, because furniture is so modular now, you could just need one small part. But if they can't get that one part, then it's just sitting in the warehouse.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, you may be wondering why I'm talking about this, checkers. And that brings me to the conspiracies circulating as a result of this incident. Yes, even a container ship running aground in the Suez Canal has piqued the QAnon folks' attention. Within minutes of the Ever Given getting stuck, QAnon supporters were spreading wild conspiracies that the ship was operated by, wait for it, Hillary Clinton, and carrying a cargo of child sex slaves. It's just terrible. Their claims were based on the fact that the Taiwanese shipping company that operates the ship is called Evergreen. Evergreen happened to be the Secret Service code name for Clinton when she was First Lady. They also point to the ship's call sign, H3RC, as further proof because of how close it is to Hillary Rodham Clinton's initials, HRC. The theories quickly made their way to Telegram and Gab, so-called free speech social media platforms, who are also known for a far-right user base. But the claims also found their way to Twitter and Facebook, where fact-checking group PolitiFact flagged and debunked them. There's also this other weird claim, Pat, that the ship's captain looks a lot like Monica Lewinsky.
Nope.
It's obviously an attempt to further link this to the Clintons. The main problem with this theory is that it's based on a fake rumor circulating on social media in Egypt claiming that Marwa al-Saladar, Egypt's first female shipmaster, is the captain of the Evergreen, which is actually false. Also, I looked up her photos. She doesn't look anything like Lewinsky outside of having long, dark brown hair. Another theory addresses the fact that before the ship entered the Suez Canal, it charted a course that looks like a drawing of a penis. The image making the rounds comes from a video created by the vessel tracking service provider vesselfinder.com. The video shows the movements of the Ever Given as it's waiting for its turn to enter the Suez Canal, basically. Another map from the ship tracking website myshiptracking.com also shows the Ever Given's route, and not gonna lie, it does resemble a crude drawing of a penis.
Right. But if you think about the crude drawing, it's two circles and an elongated circle, which would make sense for something waiting to enter the Suez Canal.
Of course. Now, the image is legit, but as Snopes concluded, there's absolutely no evidence that it was drawn on purpose. I referred to this in our group chat as penis pareidolia. Now, a spokesperson for VesselFinder.com told Vice World News that the ship's tracking data was accurate, stressing that, quote, there is no room for some kind of conspiracies or false data. But another lengthy theory posted on Telegram suggests the incident was the result of the ship's computers being hacked by those friendly to the QAnon cause. Quote, those ships are on autopilot most of the time. The computers do the work. I am suggesting that the ship's computers were hacked. My suspicions lead toward the white hats. This was part of the plan. They always say it's part of the plan. Everything's part of the plan. Right. Now, if you're driving, just pull over for this next part. The theory goes on to compare the shipping canal to a birth canal, positing that the incident was a sign that new information about the unmasking of the deep state was about to come to light. Quote, using a canal is symbolic of a birthing canal. Things are about to happen worldwide. The birthing of the information coming from this mess will be the beginning of the end of the deep state. Okay, so where are we at here? Yes, a container ship is stuck in the Suez Canal. Yes, it's a bad thing that will almost certainly have a negative effect on the supply chain for many goods. And yes, the ship took a path that could be interpreted to look like a crude drawing of a penis. This can be explained, as we mentioned earlier, by pareidolia, which we've talked about on the show many times, a tendency to perceive a specific, often meaningful image in random or ambiguous visual patterns. So you think of the man in the moon, grilled cheese with the face of Virgin Mary, smiley face on Mars, or just looking up at the clouds and seeing an animal or other patterns. Our brains are pretty programmed for pattern recognition. The rest of the theories, though, like linking this to the Clintons and child sex trafficking, are of course complete and utter fabrications.
Thanks for that, Cristina. It's bad enough as it is without this other stuff on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, we'll pass you to Adam and Darren. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
Stay classy, not smart-assy, and please stay safe.
What's up, cuboids? I was on the internet the other day, as I'm known to do. Someone posted some maps of something. I don't recall exactly what it was. Probably something COVID-19 related. That's what everyone seems to be talking about these days. So it was a standard world map, a map of the entire world. There was, different tags or there was colors or something. So one response was just an angry person who complained that this kind of map was racist, and then went on to explain in great detail how the standard world map we are most familiar with is skewed to make white countries seem bigger and countries where black and brown people live smaller. Okay. So, are maps racist? Now, the map style in question is what's known as the Mercator Projection. Now, I've heard complaints about the proportions on a standard world map before, but I hadn't heard it referred to as a racist map specifically. Now, this is an audio podcast and a picture is worth 1,000 words, so I can't really explain this, so I'll just use 1,000 words to make up for it. The Mercator Projection is basically what happens because you can't flatten a sphere onto a rectangular map. The Earth's surface is projected onto a cylinder and then flattened or unfolded into a rectangle, more or less, to make this map. The effect is that the further away from the equator something is, the bigger it seems. So Canada, which is slightly bigger than the US in reality, appears to be much bigger than the US in this style of map. Greenland, which is 14 times smaller than Africa, appears to be roughly the same size as Africa, because Greenland is far from the equator, Africa is intersected by the equator. Antarctica, being the furthest possible thing from the equator, is shown as being much larger than it really is, though some maps just sort of crop it out, so, Antarctica is not getting much special treatment. Antarctica is actually pretty big. It's the second largest country after Russia and right before Canada, but it seems to be much bigger on a Mercator projection. Usually, individual country maps aren't done in this style. So if I look at a map of Canada, for example, that's the country I happen to live in, Saskatchewan does not appear to be a perfect rectangle, even though its borders follow meridians and parallels pretty closely. So the western border follows the 110th west longitude, and the eastern one, having been measured in the 1880s, does not perfectly lie on the 102nd west longitude, but it's pretty close. The southern border with the U.S. is on the 49th parallel, with some minor measurement errors again, and on the north, they share a border with Northwest Territories along the 60th parallel. But it isn't a rectangle. It is mostly trapezoid due to the curvature of the Earth. So similarly, on a standard map of Canada, it doesn't look like a rectangle. It's somewhat like a skirt shape or a cape shaped, right? Smaller at the top, a little wider at the bottom. So when you look at a map of Canada, the borders between the Yukon and Alaska, it's at quite an angle, even though in reality this runs perfectly north-south, right? So the maps of countries that we're used to, they have their own different types of distortions. So the maps that we're used to, they have different types of distortions, but the sizes are generally correct. So the US-Canada border has a similar distortion where maps of individual countries will generally show it having a curve, but the Mercator map shows it as being straight. Well, straight for a portion on the western part of the continent. Once you get as far east as Ontario, things are no longer straight. A quick look at the US shows that a lot of states have similar but not quite rectangular, but actually trapezoidal shapes. So Wyoming and Colorado seem to match it most perfectly, but there are a lot of other states which have this along some of their borders. This really is a world map problem, not so much a problem with every map. So I wouldn't say all maps are racist, though maybe some individual maps may be racist for other reasons. So the map is not accurate. But on the topic of racism, I wasn't able to dig up the original rant, but I was able to find an article, Your Map is Racist. Here's How, from Sociology and Focus, that made similar claims, the same basic idea. So it argues that maps are a social construction that can lead us to think that Anglo nations are bigger and more central to the world than nations of color. Okay. Maps are a social construction, while maps attempt to represent reality. There's certainly potential biases and inaccuracies in them, but to call maps, not just the Mercator projection, but all maps, social constructions, well, I can see how a human would think that, but I don't think that's a useful way of saying it. But whatever. I just don't like that term. Now, the author, Nathan Palmer, recounts a talk by Jane Elliott at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she made this point. So as I mentioned earlier, Greenland is bigger than Africa on this map. She'd argued that the map makes the United States and Europe look bigger than they actually are. Now, this is technically true. Anything not located directly on the equator does in some sense appear bigger, though compared to Antarctica and Greenland, the US and Europe actually appear much smaller than those other places, so this depends on your approach to the question. The article argues that the map is used because it makes the West, so that's not the western part of the map, but the West in a concept of Western culture, look like it's the center of the world. To this specific point, Africa is actually at the center of this map. More specifically, the white portion is big, and the black and brown portions are small. Well, of course, was my first reaction. That's how it works. Darker-skinned people come from closer to the equator, and lighter-skinned people come from closer to the poles. Back in episode 563, I looked at the evolution of skin color. So basically, skin color is an adaptive trait evolved as a reaction to relative levels of ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Melanin found in darker skin protects against UV rays. Too much UV reduces folic acid, which can cause issues with fetal development. Too little UV lowers vitamin D, which is bad for bone growth. So humans evolving at different levels of UV radiation, which is higher near the equator and lower close to the North and South poles, evolved different levels of melanin based on what optimal amount of UV absorption means a good balance between folic acid and vitamin D. This means darker-skinned people near the equator, lighter-skinned people near the poles. So if you look at a map of the skin color of native people to areas, this is pretty consistent. It's all sort of black and brown near the equator, and it's lighter as you get further away. Of course, there's been immigration since these native populations were there, but population skin color largely correlates to the skin color of the native population of that area. So much to say. If you have a map style which overemphasizes the size of countries as you get further away from the equator, you will end up with places where there are more white people having bigger looking countries. So the idea that this was somehow an intentional way to put a focus on the US and Europe, that isn't really supported. When this was first used in 1569, there was no US, and North America was a largely unexplored and unknown region with little detail, and it was covered by a massive text box in the Mercator 1569 world map. Now, could it be that this system, as opposed to other map types, was preferred because the people who were well represented by it were also making the maps and supporting its use, even much later once the US existed, right? Some people still use these maps in the US. That is a possibility. I don't think it's definitively been proven. There are advantages to this type of map. It's a conformal map projection. This means that every angle between two curves which cross each other is preserved in the projection. There are other ways to project the Earth onto a map, including some other conformal projections. Some of them aren't. Sometimes you'll see the map curve inwards towards the top, right? So the map isn't totally rectangular, but the islands in the north and south are much smaller than in the Mercator projection. So basically you're taking the sphere of the Earth and you're basically spreading it out into an oval instead of a rectangle shape. The Gauss-Peters projection is another option. It basically distorts landmasses so that they end up having the correct area, but this means that they are compressed vertically as the Mercator projection has them stretched out horizontally. So Greenland is still much wider than it should be, but that is compensated by having it be much shorter top to bottom, north to south than it really is. Is this better? It's basically an additional distortion to make things more accurate by some metrics, but less accurate by some other metrics. So this is a map type that is commonly used in British schools, and it's becoming more popular in some places, I guess, because of this kind of controversy. Okay, so let's put aside the idea that this intentionally amplifies white countries and discounts black and brown countries. I don't think we can definitively answer that question, so let's just put it aside. It sounds like this was probably not racist in that it did not intentionally mean to promote white supremacy. However, that doesn't mean it doesn't unintentionally have some racist impact. I won't get into the broader philosophical question about whether something without any racist intent but which causes a negative impact to a certain racial group is racist. I think intent matters, and those who argue that it doesn't do so from an intellectually indefensible position, which has recently become very popular with certain progressive people. I think it's not constructive to use guilt and shame against someone who is not intending harm, even if they may inadvertently be doing so. That being said, it is very important to consider the unintended consequences of an action if we truly care about improving actual outcomes for people. This is the kind of stuff we generally promote on the show. So, does it actually negatively impact the people whose countries are misrepresented on the map? Do people think less of Africa and South America because they cross the equator and appear to be smaller on this kind of map? How would you measure that? Is there a lot of foreign aid going to Antarctica and Greenland instead of to Africa? I don't know. Another issue which was brought up by the talk in the article about racist maps is that if you fold world maps, the middle isn't actually the equator, but a bit north of it. This means that the map centers more on Europe and North America and displaces Australia and anything in the southern hemisphere, South America, large parts of Africa. So is this Anglo-centric, a plot to exclude the southern hemisphere? Well, no doubt someone making a map will be inclined to center it on themselves. It also needs to be considered that the Earth has 2/3 of its landmass in the northern hemisphere. So if we ignore Antarctica, which is easy enough to do because there isn't that much going on there, no offense to any listeners who may be in Antarctica, please write in if you are. There's a very empty space south of Argentina and New Zealand on the globe. The 50th parallel in the Northern Hemisphere runs right through Ontario, Quebec, much of Canada, France, Belgium, Germany, Russia, Ukraine, parts of China, all sorts of countries. The 50th parallel on the Southern Hemisphere cuts Argentina and Chile on the southern tip of South America. Centering a bit north of the equator is a practical reflection of the land distribution on the Earth. So how else can maps be racist? Well, by having north at the top. I found a funny article on the ABC News website from Australia. In it, author Gary Nunn discussed a map which he has south side up. So he has this on his wall and people mention it during Zoom calls and stuff. He says that when people ask him why his map is upside down, he says, it isn't upside down at all. Now, this would be more convincing if the clearly written title on his map wasn't Upside Down World Map. This is Upside Down World Maps? Not upside down at all. What are you saying? So north being up is somewhat arbitrary, and maps didn't even orient this way originally. South and east have been at the top of older world maps. South at the top was common for Islamic maps. In the 12th century, north started being used as the top in Europe due to compasses pointing to magnetic north. So again, does this matter? Would Australia be considered more favorably if it were at the top of the map, right? What would the consequences be, or what are the consequences of having north at the top of our map? We might not call it down under, but would we actually think differently about the country? Hard to evaluate that kind of thing, but that's the idea here. And this makes me wonder about some other terms, right? When you learn about history, Lower Egypt is in the north, while Higher Egypt is in the south. To me, that seems backwards, but it's just because of my biases. These refer to their relative distance from the Nile, and therefore higher and lower is more about elevation, I guess, than obviously they didn't have that concept of north-south at the time. I think of terms like downtown. So in a city like New York, this refers to a part of the town that is closer to the water, while uptown is away for it. But in that city, it happens to fit with north-south. The downtown is more to the south and uptown is more to the north. A city like Toronto is the same, but in Ottawa, downtown is on the northern part of the city because that's where our water is. That's where the river is, and the downtown is usually built around the shore. Beyond this, there's the idea of where the map is centered, right? So maps, world maps, generally center on Europe and Africa. So yes, it makes sense. The first maps were made in Europe, so it makes sense that they would center it on Europe. And I don't doubt that that's part of why a map is laid out like that. But how else would we do it, right? The Pacific Ocean, which is on the edges of a standard map, is the largest ocean in the world. If we shift the standard map by like half the Earth, so that you basically, it's like looking at it from the other side of the planet, then the middle of that map would be a massive empty ocean of water, with some islands in it, no offense to any Pacific Islanders, and then a bunch of very large continental landmasses towards the edges. So while a standard map no doubt is convenient for Europeans, it's also sort of a practical way to distribute landmasses on a map. Are maps racist? Well, that depends on your definition of racist. I don't believe that there is anything intentionally racist about the Mercator Projection world map, even if it has the consequence that most of the distorted areas which are shown as being larger than they actually are happen to be home to lighter-skinned native populations. The real winners are Antarctica and Greenland, who hardly control the maps. Further, I don't think it's been demonstrated that this distortion actually negatively impacts the lives of people living closer to the equator. There's sort of a mechanism there, but I don't know if that's really been proven. There are more accurate ways of displaying a map. Online maps, such as those used by Google, use Web Mercator or Google Web Mercator, which is a modified type of Mercator projection, which is much better at comparing country sizes. Ultimately, the best way to look at sizes of country is to look at a globe. So, get a globe, show your kids, have them really actually understand the accurate size of countries. It's probably good for their learning and development. This may not always be practical, but it's probably better than having a big rectangular map on your wall.
Regular listeners of the show have heard me give various book reviews over the past several months, and that's because I was just plowing through them and wanted to share. I managed to achieve my goal of finishing 100 books in 9 months in 2020. Wow. And as people tend to ask, once you tell them something like this, like, oh, what are the best books? Well, that's what this segment is for. Here are the top 5 and 2 honorable mentions. I also have links to my little reviews, which you can find at trcpodcast.com.
Great website.
And I'll briefly elaborate on each book in turn. Number 1, The Precipice by Toby Ord. This is all about the risks we face as a human civilization and how we should be doing more to combat them. It's concerned about existential threats, and it is done in a very accessible but intelligent manner. He is a philosopher and gives an excellent treatment to the topic and does it, I think, in a way that most people would find very readable. There are a lot of endnotes, so if you only listen to the audio, you might be missing 30 to 40% of the book.
Wow.
That's what happened to me the first time. Because people are like, this book's amazing. I'm like, this book's all right. They're like, what about all the information? I'm like, what do you mean? Oh, yeah. Okay, I missed out a lot. Number 2, The Weirdest People in the World by Joe Henrich. This is an epic book about psychology, history, anthropology, sociology, and Western civilization. It'll be probably one of the more influential books in this year and, the years to come.
Yeah.
There's, other photos and text in the book, but in short, Western people came to have their atypical psychological inclinations due to a shift from kin-based interpersonal relationships to broader societal institution-based relationships, and this is primarily around 1000 to 1500 AD. A lot of words in there, but that's exactly what it is. Mm-hmm. This was largely due to the influence of the church and its protocols. This is the good old Christian Catholic Church there, and its protocols around marriage and family, but also universities, guilds, innovation, and other variables. The book offers significantly more than people are just different than me, because it provides a better understanding of the world, how things came to be, why you might have particular beliefs you have, and why some of these beliefs and practices are not easily transferable. I agreed with a lot of what he wrote. I found it very illuminating. Was everything perfect? No. Was some of it speculative? Yes, and he even admits that.
Yeah, he that's what I liked about the book. He admitted when he didn't know, and he admitted he demonstrates very well when there was strong evidence to support something that he was saying.
Yes. Number 3, Economic Facts and Fallacies by Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is known for being more on the right-leaning conservative side of things. I was mainly introduced to his thought only recently. Some of the stuff has to be definitely judged with skepticism, as you should when you're reading anything. But I found this very illuminating because the parts that I already understood a bit better, he addressed in great detail and with data. For example, when people talk about the gender pay gap, they usually just take an overall average without delving more deeply whether the right people are being compared. We want to know if someone with similar skills, similar experience, and other similar abilities or inclinations is being paid the same for the same job, generally speaking. Yeah. Now, equity might do similar jobs, but generally speaking, people don't do that. And so he looks at a broad range of these sorts of things and really tries to think, well, I know you've been taught to believe this, but if you look at the data, this might be the case. It's always good to take into accounts that are a bit different than what you are led to believe. Number 4, Innate by Kevin Mitchell. This is a very intelligent and nuanced overview of how the wiring of our brains affects who we are. Mitchell writes very well, explaining concepts clearly while still managing rigor and depth. I've had exposure to most of the topics covered, but this treatment is superior to most that I've read. Yeah. It is largely because he takes the time to delineate concepts and issues that are often conflated. For example, he repeatedly communicates that something can be innate or even heritable, but not genetic. If that sounds peculiar, go read the book. It's great. Yeah. Randomness plays a role in how our neural pathways develop, and that is often underappreciated. Additionally, his treatment of the analysis of variance was great. Most people don't realize that what is being discussed is not why something is a certain way, but the reasons for the differences observed among those things. It's an important point, and it does matter, and most people just kind of skip over it. Further, just because something might genetically affect X doesn't mean it's actually the thing for X. Analogously, the existence of your spark plugs in your car has a huge influence on your ability to drive. But few would say spark plugs are either what makes a car or that they constitute driving. This was his example. You're like, aha, who would have thought neurogenetics is complicated? He does get into issues of personality, development, and sex differences. I loved his message at the end about promoting greater acceptance of the diversity of who we are, and it is throughout. If there may be differences, it doesn't mean people are inferior in any way. It just means we should broadly understand and realize that people are different, and it's very hard to change anything that's innate, like in the title.
Yeah. Yeah, he's very good not to judge, sort of to quantify a better or worse in any specific metric. It's just this is what's going on, right?
Exactly. The writing was so good. Very often, I wished I could memorize how he expressed things so that I could later communicate it to others. And I also mentioned because I used audio, the audio narrator was great also. Number 5, Warnings by Clark and Eddy. This is, I thought, an interesting and important book. Warning seeks to explore how we can better understand those who have warned us of disasters and calamities facing humanity, which they call Cassandras, and why they were not listened to. The book first explores those who warned of problems in the past, then tries to deduce an evaluative criteria of when we should probably listen to people sounding the alarm bells, and then applies this criteria to potential Cassandras who exist in the present but are warning about the future. It is wonderfully broad in subject matter, ranging from war in the Middle East and the Fukushima disaster to financial collapses, artificial intelligence, asteroid impacts, and CRISPR-Cas9. Cool. I think their notion of a Cassandra coefficient is an excellent idea, but their execution of it could have been a bit better. I think they didn't want to make it too detailed. I know they both have experience like with the U.S. policy and working U.S. government. You're like, well, people are busy. If something has many variables, they're not going to look at it. If you can provide like a simple chart or a simple axis or simple bullet points, it's more likely to achieve anything. And that's, why they were doing it that way. I commend them for being very practically minded and presenting the material in an accessible manner, as well as providing a plan to implement things and hopefully improve things. What a concept. No longer do I like books like, this is what's wrong with the world. Like, how do you plan to change it there? So those are my top 5, but I also wanted to say 2 other ones which I quite liked. The Caped Crusade, Batman and the Rise of Nerd Culture. I did mention this briefly on one of the episodes long ago as an aside. It's just a great book. If you like Batman, if you like nerd culture, you'll like this. It's the audio, I highly recommend it because he does voices in different ways, which adds to the delight of it. And then finally, Logi Comics. This is one of the best graphic novels I've ever read. It's probably for the 3rd time last year. It's a delightful exploration of Bertrand Russell's failed quest to ground math and truth in logic. It's smart. It's a good story. It's well drawn. I love the ideas and the ways in which they were communicated. For a bit of context, if you're just looking for book recommendations from me, it isn't really relevant if I finished a good book this year or a previous year, right? Sure. I mean, like, I really, which ones do you recommend? Like, well, why would that matter? I mean, that's what you say because that's what people do. But anyway, if you're looking for a general recommendation, I would recommend everyone read, shockingly, McCaskill's The Most Good You Can Do and or Peter Singer's Practical Ethics. I would also love people to read Dennett's Elbow Room or Darwin's Dangerous Idea, but I know Dennett isn't for everyone. So Robert Wright's The Moral Animal is a decent intro to evolutionary stuff.
Darren, any fiction books you enjoy this year? I know you don't read them quite as much as maybe I do, but...
Nothing comes to mind. I read a couple and nothing stands out.
Okay.
I've tended to shift to having fiction be like movies and TV.
Yeah.
And more of the reading and listening being nonfiction.
Sure. That makes sense.
Do you have any fiction recommendations?
Oh yeah, I'm kind of on the spot here. I don't know. I read a bunch of The Expanse this year, and I'm really digging that book series and the show as well. And
I finally saw the first season. I'm like, oh yes, I see why people watch this.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter @TRC_podcast.